Okay, if you've been following along, we've been reviewing the Ten Commandments and how the Ten Commandments are actually God's laws put in place to govern the relationship between human beings and things that are not human beings. And the purpose of that governance is to produce an environment that allows for life to emerge, sustain, and flourish. So we're going to continue our study and move on now from the second commandment, which is to not create idols, on to the third commandment, which is to not misuse God's name. Now, this is a commonly misunderstood commandment. So let's view this through the lens of what relationship is God trying to govern with this particular law, right? We talked about how the first law, which is to have no other gods before him, is to govern our relationship with spiritual beings, with beings that have power, that are God's creation, but are not the creator. So that first commandment governs how we interact with those beings. It sets the parameters for the relationship between superior beings that are not God. The second one governs our conception of God. How do we think about God? How do we imagine God? And so that's your second command. It talks about not creating idols, not worshiping idols. That has to do again with the conception of God. Now you have to remember that all of these laws are not simply the application that we see in the natural. There's a spiritual, supernatural component to it. So we're not discussing the application of these laws with the people of Israel in the time, but what we're actually discussing is the spiritual implication, the undertones of what this law was intended to govern beyond the physical application that was occurring in the time of Israel. Okay, so with this framework of the law governing relationships, we're going to now move into the third one, which is to say you are not to use lightly the name of Adonai your God, because Adonai will not leave unpunished someone who uses his name lightly. Now, what we have to understand here is in what way would a person use God's name? People frequently like to say that when somebody says GD, right, and we know what that means, that is using God's name in vain, which is incorrect. Why? Because God's name is not God. God is a description of who God is or what God is. It is not a name for God. People also commonly cite the use of Jesus Christ being used as a slang or as an expression of frustration as another way that God's name is being used in vain, which once again is an incorrect application, because we have to look at this through spiritual eyes and understand what would be the purpose of using God's name and why would he create a law to govern our relationship to the use of God's name. So to understand this, we have to understand what is the use of God's name. Well, the use of God's name is power. You see, God's name is power. When we say we're going to do something in the name of Jesus, that is invoking the power and authority of Jesus Christ in the earth by the utilization of his name. If somebody comes and says, I'm here to perform this task on behalf of Haveh, one of the names for the God that we worship as Christians, as people who believe in Jesus and in the Torah that Jesus supported, right? So for those of us who believe in that, what that means is the names of God. It's saying when somebody uses God's name or claims to be doing something on behalf of God, that is the use of his name that God is concerned with. He is concerned with our relationship with the utilization of his name to basically tell somebody that we're coming in authority. A great example of this would be the, I can't remember who they were, but it's in the New Testament. There were a couple of guys who went and started trying to cast a demon out in the name of Jesus. And the demon said, I know Paul, I know Jesus, I don't know you, and then attacked them and severely injured them. This would be an example of someone using God's name incorrectly because they were claiming to be coming in the name of Jesus, but they were not actually coming in the name of Jesus because they didn't have the appropriate association to be doing it. So then, the third law of not using the Lord's name lightly or in vain has to do with using his name in a way that is inappropriate to what you have actually been sent or authorized to do. Okay, so now let's move on to the fourth law, which regards the Sabbath. And it says, remember the day Shabbat to set it apart for God. You have 6 days to labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Shabbat for Adonai your God. On it you are to do no kind of work, and then it goes into a bunch of detail on all the different types of work. And it says, for in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them, but on the seventh day he rested. This is why Adonai blessed the day, Shabbat, and separated it for himself. Okay, so what this is governing is our relationship to work and provision. Now, there's a whole much deeper spiritual meaning here, but we're not going to get into the totality of that in this video. We'll save that for another time. But for the purpose of this video, the most important thing to understand is what this is trying to govern. It's not about a day. It's not about a special day. We know that because Paul said that it is his conviction that no day is actually special. No specific day is special. No specific festival is special. It's what the thing represents, because we know that all things in the earth are types and shadows of things in heaven. They are not the actual thing. So the day Shabbat, the seventh day, whether it's a Saturday or a Sunday, whatever that is, none of that matters, because that is a type and shadow of something greater that is happening in heaven. And so the question is, well, what is the type and shadow representing? And what it's representing is the relationship to work and provision, which is why we are commanded to rest on the seventh day. It is not just for us to rest, but it is also to allow the things that we are working at to rest as well. A high level of this that I want to get into that I'm not going to do right now would simply be that this is the relationship to our ability to produce, and essentially it has to do with faith and greed. So on one side you have fear of not being fully provided for and feeling like you need to work like round the clock in order to make sure you're supplied, and so that governing of the relationship to work is an instruction for us to live by faith that God is the ultimate supplier, not us. And so that act of setting aside a day to rest is a demonstration of that trust. Simultaneously, it is a buffer against greed. So if you have a person that is prone to be greedy, who wants to go out and acquire, then it also produces a buffer where we set aside a day to Adonai in order to buffer against the greed in men's hearts that would drive them to work 7 days a week and to produce 7 days a week. Now, there are so many layers to this. Anybody that's watching this and wants to say, no, it's actually about this or it's about that, it probably is about all of those things as well, to be honest, because this particular law it shows up in so many different places. Like, it shows up as a midrash in regard to entering into God's rest, which was something that you saw in I want to say it wasn't Kings. No, further back, Exodus. Yeah, so it was during the time where Joshua was entering into the promised land, and there was a group of Israelites that were not allowed to enter the promised land, and then that's referenced again in the New Testament to say that they were not allowed to enter into God's rest, and so another time was appointed in the future for Israel to enter into God's rest. And so there's a whole entire, there's a whole thing that we could do with this one. So, for the sake of this particular level that we are operating within, what this law had to do with governing was the relationship to work and production and supply. That's what it's governing. And then there are lots and lots of layers that we can get into. Okay, so next we're going to get into honor your mother and father, right? This one's really simple. It governs the relationships between parents and children. That's it. Honor your mother and father. So we have yet again another law that is in place to govern the relationships between human beings and things outside of us as well as each other, right? So that's what these laws are intended to govern. In fact, when you get down past the remembering the Shabbat, the vast majority of these actually now have to do with how we relate to one another. So children, honor your mother and father. So that law is to govern that relationship, how you are to engage with parents. Then you have do not murder. So once again, governing the way that we interact with one another. Don't kill each other. Next one, do not commit adultery, governing how we interact with one another sexually, only within a marriage. And there's a whole lot of depth we could get into on that. In fact, I'll actually pause on that one because I think this one is probably one of the best laws where you can show a clear example, this law actually produces an environment where life is able to sustain and flourish, and how violating that law actually produces an environment of death and destruction. And that is what we're going to talk about in the next video. How the law, do not commit adultery, is a direct representation of this entire concept that we've been reviewing of God's laws producing an environment where life is able to be established, sustain and flourish, and then how the violation of God's laws produces an environment where death, destruction, and violence is the thing that begins to emerge. And so we're going to review that in the context of the seventh law, do not commit adultery, in the next video. I hope you'll keep following along and exploring this concept with me. So until then, see you next time.